Yo,
Yo, what's up? Can you hear me?
not much. Yeah, I can hear you.
Oh, nice. All right. How's it going, Vaush?
I'm doing great. How about you?
That's fantastic. I'm doing well. All right. So, first of all, thank you for letting me on. Are you on stream?
Yeah, we're streaming live right now. Are you using push to talk or voice activation?
Oh, I can turn off push to talk.
No, no, you're fine to use push to talk. Just if you're going to do so, hold the button down a little bit longer before you finish your sentence because you're clipping off the last syllable.
Okay, yeah, yeah, it does that. Okay.
So what's up? Hit me up.
Well, first of all, thank you for letting me on. This is a big opportunity. I represent a group in Southern California called LearnMarks Orange County. We're the sister group of another group called LearnMarks Los Angeles, and we operate
Makes sense.
a reading group here, not just in real life, but also on Discord.
Hmm.
And yeah, basically what we do is we go through like text from the first international, second international. We read Marx, Engels, Lenin, Bakunin, Luxemburg, and I just wanted to give, first of all, a chance to, shout out our group to your audience. I mean, you have quite a big audience.
You cut out. I have quite
Oh
a
yeah,
big.
sorry, I'll keep it on. You have quite a big audience.
Oh yeah, well I try. It's big maybe for like left too, but we're getting up there. Okay, we don't have those Steven Crowder numbers yet, but we're gonna get there.
Yeah, I feel you. So thanks for that. I appreciate it. But I was in a meeting a while ago, a few months ago, and I met this guy, and he's a bit younger than me.
Hmm.
And he said that he's a fan of yours, and I looked up your YouTube channel, and I didn't really find your economic takes, but he told me some interesting things about you that I kind of had some contentions with that I wanted to discuss with you.
Yeah, hit it up. There are a couple of videos where I discuss more economically oriented stuff, but I tend not to focus on it that much because I am generally of the opinion that people don't really have that many principled economic positions. They usually have social positions and use economics as a way of trying to attain those positions. So it seems kind of like a proxy argument. I'd rather argue like the ought rather than the is. But yeah, I think I can clarify most of my positions here. Hit it up.
Yeah, so first of all, what I heard you're an anarchist, which is, I have arguments against anarchism, but I don't really mind
Hmm.
that. What I really mind is that you said you were a market socialist?
Yeah.
Okay, so from the Marxist perspective, market socialism would actually be an oxymoron. It would actually be capitalist.
No, I'm well. Socialism is comprised of two components, right? Fundamentally, you have the seizure of the means of production, and you have the abolition of the commodity form. I use market socialism just literally as a term to describe one in which you seize the means of production but don't abolish the commodity form, at least not for everything. But I would make the argument that the social changes associated with the seizure of the means of production are so significant they cannot possibly be called capitalism, especially when capitalism is broadly defined as the private ownership of the means of production, laissez-faire economy and what have you. So I wouldn't consider it like a form of capitalism.
Well, yeah, that's a definition that we hear a lot on the internet, but I would actually have to argue against that definition because it really encompasses every previous society post the agricultural revolution, like slave society and feudal society. And even though they didn't have surplus value extraction, they had surplus labor extraction. So really, all of
So you're
three of these
saying,
societies had private ownership of the means of production. So
are
that
you making
definition
the
would not count.
argument that every economy that hasn't abolished the commodity form is capitalism, like it's been capitalism for all of human history up until now?
Well, the commodity form exists before capitalism. What capitalism is generalized commodity production, right? So, in order to get to a mode of production outside of capitalism, you couldn't have generalized commodity production. That's what I'm saying.
So, what distinguishes, if that is the case, our current system of capitalism from what we would have seen during the feudal era? What fundamentally distinguishes those two systems for you?
So, a couple things. Number one is the relations of, well, actually, not the relations, the mode of production. And the mode of production to Marx was the physical aspects of it. The means of production back then were mainly agricultural, and now they're ran on factories and the working day. And there's three main aspects to capitalism that distinguish it. Generalized commodity production. So back in feudalism, you would have serfs who would work on their plot, and then they would go and work on the lord's plot, and they would take the products of the serf's labor. the nobles would, and then they would answer to a higher authority. So
Hmm.
that's number one, generalized commodity production. And then number two is generalized wage labor. So what Marx meant by wage labor is basically the market that's created for the subsistence of the working class. But that wasn't a thing with feudalism because in feudalism they would spin their own clothes and produce their own food and stuff like that. And
Yeah.
then the third thing is the third and final thing I would argue is really a governance of production according to um, how do I put this? Basically, where it is the most profitable. So rather than, hey, you know, our Lord has demanded of us that we produce X amount of clothes or work on the farm X amount of hours, everything, including the means of production, is now a commodity. Everything is a commodity, and that's what really separates feudalism from
But I
capitalism.
feel like to varying degrees, all three of those characteristics are applicable in both societies. When I was taught, and I apologize if my definition here is different from yours,
No, that's
but
fine.
the feudalism was a form of mercantile capitalism. The fundamental distinction between life at then economically and life today economically is that back then, generally speaking, large capital enterprises were associated with with the will of the monarchy. That there was a that essentially the broader economic productivity of society, the larger market trends, were those associated with with the will of the central authority. Whereas we nowadays have laissez-faire capitalism, where anyone can produce any business for any reason. They're beholden only to the whims of the market. There isn't really a direct association between the will of the state and the will of the corporations, as so many people are coming to discover here in this country. That was the distinguishing characteristic that I was taught. I recognize that maybe these definitions are sort of follow from which theory you read. That was the working definition I was given. I don't think it's really that pragmatic to describe a market socialist society as just being another form of capitalism, because the fundamental relations between the capital owners and those who must sell their labor has been destroyed. It seems like it's a little bit difficult, I think, to relay that description when such a fundamental economic change has been brought about. No.
Well, yeah, but I have to look at your older tweets, and I don't want to get too into the USSR, but you did say that the USSR was state capitalist, and they did not
Hmm.
have the buying and selling of the means of production.
Well, they didn't have the buying and selling of the means of production. That is entirely true. But they definitely had I guess the disproportionate distribution of the means of production to privileged party officials. So I wouldn't say state capitalism has to adhere to all the characteristics of like typical laissez-faire capitalism.
Well, it's a little bit weird to describe it that way because Marx does say that in Critique of the Gotha program that well, basically Marx says that a proportion of what workers produce will go to the state. Whether or not state individuals received X amount of money is nor here and there. The thing is that in previous socialist societies that have existed, there were um, there were no distinctions. There were no class distinctions, but there was still generalized commodity production. And essentially, what you would get there is a group of like, just imagine like what Richard Wolff talks about. Just imagine like America, but entirely of co-ops. In
Hmm.
that scenario, what would happen is all of the co-ops would still be in competition for profit.
Yeah, of course, it's still a market economy, but it's socialist. It's socialist because fundamentally the workers own the means of production. I think that's a wonderful thing, no? Many of the problems we have in our society today are formed from the fundamental distinction between the power and influence of those who own capital and those who must sell their labor. If you abolish that distinction, you bring about an entirely new type of society. It's not a perfect one. We're not done working from that point, but I think it is a substantial step forward. And because it fundamentally challenges the base political nature of capitalism as we know it today, I would consider it a very fundamentally different society. I mean, I doubt we could ever achieve such a thing without revolutionary activity anyway. So it's hardly some tiny incremental change, you know?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's like the exact same thing as like bourgeois liberal democracy, but how that would really turn out is if you had a bunch of co-ops just competing against each other, they would have to intensify their labor and they would have to basically pay themselves less and seize that money. Capital would essentially seize that money, and so what you would have
Wait,
is
what is capital?
well, you know that you can have capitalism without capitalists, right?
Well, I would make the argument that you could not, because I would call market socialism a form of socialism. But you say that co-ops will exploit themselves to participate in the market. But from the evidence that I've seen at this time, worker co-ops tend to have significantly higher standards of living and proportionally higher wages than traditionally owned firms, in addition to their democratic mode. So we're still operating on a pretty substantial, upgrade. This may even become the case more in a society that doesn't necessarily discriminate against worker co-ops as we do today with preferential loans handed out by banks. Maybe things will get even better.
Well, yeah, I mean, like, well, yeah, I mean, to compare a co-op to like just like Walmart, which absolutely tries everything it can to exploit its workers by incrementing as much surplus value as possible. I think worker co-ops would be a better alternative, but I don't think they should be the final alternative because in a cooperative, in a society of competition based on worker cooperatives, what they're going to do is essentially pay themselves less in order to undercut other firms by having more capital.
I don't know if that's borne out in the data. In fact, yeah, I don't know if that's borne out. I've seen data suggesting that worker cooperatives will usually have, like, employees will willingly cut their pay rather than lose, like, workers. Like, they'll cut their pay so they can keep more people on payroll. But I haven't seen any evidence that they'll, like, push themselves down to lower and lower dredges of exploitation, so that they can continue to compete. It is, after all, entirely possible, as has been made evident by, I mean, like, here's an example. Corporations, even cutthroat corporations, pay their CEOs exorbitant amounts of money. Now, that's not money that's going towards the capital interests of the company. That's just going to the person who runs the company. But in worker co ops, everyone runs the company. So we already have evidence of obscene generosity being diverted from the capital ownership of the firm towards those who work at the firm. The only difference is it's going only to the CEO as opposed to going to everyone who works there. So I feel like there's already a fair amount of evidence indicating that not only are firms willing to pull money away from capital to reward themselves, but that they have done so without it undercutting their ability to compete in the market.
Well, yeah. I mean, just going back and saying again, like, just completely disregarding. Well, actually, worker co-ops wouldn't really be able to compete with capitalist firms as efficiently, and I think we see
Well, they
that
do it.
today.
No, they do at the moment. Right now, it seems like they're more resistant to price shocks. They tend to treat their employees better. And there are even some instances where they tend to outperform. In fact, I remember reading, now there could be conflating statistics here, like shadow variables, but it seems like a significantly higher percentage of worker co-ops survive that critical first 5 year period than traditionally owned firms. Now, that could, of course, be because, like, maybe there's a higher inherent level of stability involved if you're willing to take the plunge into making a co-op. I'm not sure, but it's a very statistically significant difference. Now, there is evidence to suggest that worker co-ops don't do quite as well on massive, like, multinational corporate scales, but I think one could make a decent argument that this has more to do with our current society's inability to properly manage the construction of such an enterprise than an inherent inability to develop such a thing. You'd have to have, like, a very, like, multi-tiered system of hierarchy within the worker co-op that would still have to have some kind of democratic representation. It'd be really tough to do, I admit, but I think it's worth it for, keeping 100,000 or more people from being exploited.
Yeah, worker co-ops are definitely a better alternative than, just a regular corporation. But I feel
Mhm.
like logically, if you were to take two firms and then each produce, let's say, $20 of value in one day, and then each, let's say they used $10 of to pay back capital, pay back wages, one of these firms is going to have to undercut themselves essentially to absorb the capital of the other firm.
Yeah, sure. Well, yeah, I mean, that's a problem with markets, right? Like, markets are still pretty imperfect, but there are a lot of imperfections with centrally planned economies as well. There are many issues with, like, market economies that I'm willing to, like, acknowledge and take a look at. But one thing that bothers me is that people who advocate for, like, centrally planned economies completely ignore the massive historical problems that we have had with said economies. which really bugs me. I think I'm an anarcho-syndicalist long term. I do believe there are ways that markets can serve the public good. I want most things decommodified. Maybe luxury goods could stay a market issue, but um, yeah, I do believe that pretty firmly. I agree there are problems with markets, though.
Yeah, I think historically, actually, the historical examples, we can look at. I'm sure you're familiar with Project Cybersyn in Chile.
I've heard rumors, but if you could fill me in, I would appreciate that.
Yeah, so sorry, I'm having a cigarette. So
No
in
worries, stay
Chile,
strong.
in Chile, basically there was a giant workers trucker strike, and I have a citation here. Even though 10 to 30% of trucks were in operation, Chile was still able to deliver 50 to 70% of the normal supply and delivered 95% of the normally delivered raw materials to key sectors of the economy. So what they
Makes
did,
sense.
what they did is they said, okay, rather than let the market dictate where resources will go, let's rationally plan the economy so that we can get raw materials. And that's what the Soviet Union did as well, is they said, well, should we have the market be, determining our entire society? Well, no, because the market would just move towards consumer goods instead of industry because that's what's most profitable. So,
The issue I have with that, though, is the only reason your aforementioned example with Chile works is because there were previous market forces that were able to help the government determine the proper allocation of resources. So the issue isn't like, can the state centrally plan the distribution of this, and this to that, and that? That's easy. You just have to have the roads, the trucks, and the drivers. But it's constantly responding to an ever shifting set of conditions as to what the people are interested in, what they need at any given time. That's something that centrally planned economies struggle with. It seems like that instance you gave me was that one in which they had to only temporarily take over an otherwise like market planned route. And I can understand how they would be able to do that. But there were shortages and central planning problems all the time in economies that like attempted central planning. And in all these economies, from Vietnam to the USSR, black markets developed for people to try to compensate for the deficiencies in those markets by buying and selling stuff, often illegally, to or bartering usually to try and fill in those gaps. Which seems to me like a pretty huge market failure or centrally planning failure.
yeah, I would agree about the black market. The black market issue is going to be huge, but just to clarify here, the USSR actually did have a market economy before Stalin introduced 5-year plans. It was actually through the new economic policy, which was like an attempted bourgeois revolution. So what they did is they figured out that I believe it was something like 70% of all grain was produced by private kulaks, and heavy industry essentially was nationalized and centralized from that privatization after recollectivization. And they already had that, so it's the same thing with Chile. Like they already had a market basis to go on, and I don't really see how that would really be an issue. I mean, no matter what, a centrally planned economy is going to come out of a market system, but they weren't relying on a market system. They were relying on teleprompters to essentially calculate, what would need to be produced and where it would go.
Yeah, I mean, I would need to familiarize myself more with those specific examples before I could think up of counter arguments. My main issue is it just seems like if we're talking about very basic goods like food, healthcare, water, all that stuff, um, it seems like these are very easy things for the state to plan out. And I support the decommodification of these industries, though as an anarchist, I don't exactly support the state. Marx was himself not a statist, so it would be preferable, of course, for some other democratic institution to supplant the state in this role. But if we're talking about housing or food, then yeah, I'm totally fine with that being brought all about. But when it comes to like luxury goods or more advanced stuff, it seems like market forces are the only ones that are meaningfully capable of meeting human needs. Unless you want to do some like really like I don't know, like paleo Marxist, almost like Ann Prim, like people only need this,
Antagonist.
this, and this, like we don't need these luxuries to survive kind of stuff. But that always kind of like, I've heard a lot of communists argue that, like, why do you need all the luxury goods the market can afford you? Human, like, well being comes from other things. You don't need this, you don't need that. Really weird way to go. Like, is this the better economic system? Like, one where we have to forgo luxury goods in favor of, like, a more stark, uh, um, consumptive practices. I feel like there are ways to balance these two things.
Well, yeah, I would actually say that, well, in order to even make luxury goods, you have to have a division of labor, and in order to get that, you have to have basic necessities met. So, it would be most logical to have the absolute necessities met, first of all, which is like what, the Soviet Union did. Like, post World War II, there was no housing, so they built, what people call commie blocks, which were the huge giant apartments all over the Eastern Bloc.
Yeah, but those
Um,
were not great.
yeah, I know
Those,
they weren't great, but
yeah.
it's better than living on the street and being a prostitute during Yeltsin. But um, what was I gonna say? What point did you just make right now?
I don't know if the majority of the population was living on the street being prostitutes under Yeltsin. I don't have like the hard statistics in hand, but I
Oh
feel
yeah,
like
the number of suicides just absolutely skyrocketed, and Russia was completely pillaged. You had all kinds of petrol companies and all kinds of heavy industry capitalists basically going into Russia and just completely dismantling Russia. And we had the U.S. basically, what's the word, rigging an election in order to ensure that the Communist Party couldn't get reelected, and we had stuff like that, happen.
I would need to familiarize myself. Does it is it a little bit weird, do you think, that all of the former officials of the Communist Party ended up becoming like capitalist oligarchs the nanosecond they had the ability to?
I actually wouldn't call them capitalist according to the Marxist definition, no.
Then there's something worse than capitalist. They leverage state power to seize control of huge amounts of infrastructure, and they're now like these oligarchical billionaires that rule over the wasteland of Russia like aristocrats. Like Putin was former KGB, right? One of the things that bugs me is when I'm looking like, why do I want capitalism gone? Like I want to fundamentally abolish these hierarchical relationships between the people and the people who rule. And then like we get the USSR and it seems like we didn't do anything. Like we swapped a bunch of meaningless pieces around, we painted everything red and we got our gray Soviet, housing blocks, and the state took control of this and that. And but then at the end of the day, like the moment the lights came back on, like everybody like shuffled around at their chairs and bingo, we've got a situation that is slightly less oligarchical than the fucking czar, um, prior. And it makes me think like we never like there was never really any infrastructure for equality that was built. It was like a really flawed and failed attempt to supplant a previous hierarchy with a new, almost more sinister hierarchy. I mean, fuck, at least in the US we can vote, right? I mean, only party officials could vote in Soviet Russia, and even then they had to make the ballots like closed door because people were afraid of reprisal
Well,
if they
most of
voted.
the party members in the USSR were actually manual laborers.
Yeah, but it was still 10% of the population, and you're still maintaining a class distinction there.
No, I wouldn't say that because in order to have a class distinction, you have to purchase means of production, you have to purchase labor power, which,
No, class in a sociological sense. Like there's still a
okay.
fundamental distinction. Yeah, yeah. There's still a fundamental distinction between the political power and prestige of a party official and of a common worker, even if they work at the same plant. I mean, there are stories of people like they'd be afraid to express political dissidence like next to people who they thought might be party officials because they knew that they would get credits, that they would turn them in, and children would turn in like parents to the state, and like the state would crack down on black markets even when they were just trying to get like razor blades to the population so the men could shave. Like there was a lot of really like horrible stuff going on in the USSR that would like unironically worse than America. Like America is not my favorite country, but I don't know, like how much does it say about our socialist project when like here's our best effort and like the USSR is more tyrannical and less efficient than ours.
Well, I think that's a very libertarian argument to make is to try to
I do
compare the
like freedom.
USSR is to try to we can get to anarchism in a bit when you want, but trying to compare the U.S. to the USSR is very, very difficult because obviously the USSR went from horse carriages and Rasputin to, you know, having the second highest GDP per capita, which doesn't always translate to health and happiness, but they did things in their constitution that are absolutely revolutionary that I can't imagine America ever doing, like guaranteeing housing, guaranteeing health care. Pragmatically speaking, just living in a Soviet country, I mean, I can't even, I'm 25 next year, or I guess after next year when I'm 27, my health insurance is going to run out from my parents. And, I mean,
I guess, but that's just my issue though. Like they guaranteed health care, but their health care was still worse than America's on average per capita. They also lied about a fuck ton of statistics concerning their healthcare shit because like they knew it would make them look bad if they revealed that they had like entire cities that were relying off like one ventilator or like 10 hospital beds per thousand people. They guaranteed housing to everyone, but there was, I mean, they did. I don't actually know that much about the homelessness rates in the USSR. I would be very willing to accept the idea that the US had it worse in that respect. But a lot of the housing that they did have was woefully insubstantial and undermaintained. That's like the issue I have. These are like these very tepid, like kind of meaningless gestures at equality. But then like you look up and you're still being ruled over by an authoritarian leader. You still can't like express political dissident without being 1984 or anything. That stuff like really bugs me. I do take a libertarian approach to this. To me, the ultimate goal is the well-being and freedom of the individual, and I think the best way to achieve that is through a socialist or down the line maybe anarchist society. Um, I don't know if that's what the USSR like did or have or anything. I do respect the achievements in industrialization they engaged in, though, but every country had a giant industrial boom, and Russia is the biggest country on earth. It makes sense that they would have benefited from that massively, whether they were capitalist or socialist. In fact, it was Marx who said that capitalism was a necessary transitional period on the way to socialism because capitalism best facilitates the material developments that allow for the growth of a socialist society. But Russia didn't do that. They went straight from feudalism to socialism. So it seems like, again, I'm not saying they didn't do like good things ever. It just seems like there were a lot of like really shitty underlying problems that can't really be explained away by American imperialism or they started off as a feudal country, you know?
yeah, two things. Um, I mentioned regardless of how they did, I mentioned the attempt for them, and I talked about the U.S., and I think you would agree that even an attempt to have these things that human beings need, like food and clothing, is far substantially better than, a landlord kicking you out and leaving you homeless and without clothes. And the second thing is, oh fuck, what did you just say, dude? What was the last thing you just said?
The very last thing I said. Yeah, I don't have a great memory.
Yeah, welcome to my
Um,
world.
yeah. Yeah, I think I said like fundamentally like the industrialization of the Soviet Union seems like it would have happened anyway.
Oh,
So
yeah. So
yeah,
you said that they went from feudalism to socialism. Well, they didn't really. They had war communism, which Trotsky actually supported, but and Lenin was against. But they went from war communism and they actually went into the new economic policy, which was that capitalist stage. But the reason why that Marx saying that we have to go to capitalism to um, socialism today, well, obviously, I think you would agree today that's irrelevant because at the time there was only three real major superpowers of capitalism, and that was the U.S., Germany, and the U.K.
right.
So I feel like we've already gone past those stages of like Mao's New Democracy or Lenin's New Economic Policy, and we're at a point now where we've had markets forever. And look at, I don't want to be cliche, but like just look at coronavirus. Like the state should step in like it does in times of war. Like in the state, the war state does not need consumer goods. It needs tanks and planes and all of these, and that's why states will centralize their economy during wartime because it's more efficient to what it needs.
I'm not opposed to the centralization of the state and the economy at certain times of national emergency. And I have actively argued in favor of the state taking a greater role in like COVID-19 preparedness. I don't disagree with that at all. I don't know what military preparedness has to do with this. I think the US were probably pretty good on military armaments at the moment. Um, but yeah, like I feel like you kind of sidestep that a little bit though, because like war communism failed. Like Lenin literally hit like the shut off switch because it didn't work. They I
Well,
mean
yeah, I
they
agree.
yeah, 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 but like fundamentally I'm just saying like a lot of the problems that the Soviet Union had can't be explained away by industrialization because every other country was industrializing at the time. I don't think that, like, now, did they do a phenomenal job quickly industrializing? Sure. So did the United States of America. So did Great Britain. So did Germany. It seems like industrialization was just a thing that was going to happen no matter what, and any sufficiently populous country with a sufficient political will could have probably mobilized their population to a comparable degree. And there were great losses all across the world. Um, with respect to industrialization. I mean, the USSR, obviously, plenty of people died during the 5 year plans, but holy shit, in the US, in the fucking tenements that we set up outside the factories, a lot of fucking people died too. So the only point that I'm getting across here is that there seems like there were a lot of parallels here that don't meaningfully address the underlying problem that, for all of its talk and pretense, the Soviet Union never really meaningfully did anything that it claimed to do. And to your earlier example, I would much rather live in a society where healthcare isn't a guaranteed right, but people still generally have better healthcare, than a society where it is a guaranteed right, but there's woefully insubstantial medical coverage because the society isn't wealthy enough to actually cover the needs of the people. I prefer the outcome to the intention any day of the week. And now, this isn't meant to be like me railing against socialism or anything. It's not. But the USSR was never socialist, and nor was Mao's China. I mean, none of these countries ever even came close to a truly democratized like workplace. Like, I think it's easy to abolish the commodity form, especially if you're willing to throw a lot of power in the hands of a state. But to me, like, the most important precept here is democracy. It's about freedom. It's about well-being, and I just don't know how this reification of those societies serves us in that goal.
Well, I think pragmatically, the USSR was a lot better than Tsarist Russia. I mean, Lenin wrote various books on women's struggles. Ethnic groups and minorities, such as the Jews, actually had rights, voting rights.
Until Stalin came along.
Well.
No, no,
It's a bit
that's
of a complicated history. I mean, if you want to
no,
go
that's a
into it, we
pretty
can.
big failing if you can't prevent literal totalitarians from seizing your government. That hasn't happened in the US yet. We've had some really bad presidents, but nothing even close to Stalin. That's a pretty severe failing of the internal political workings of the Soviet Union.
Well, hold on. Before we go into the political workings, I want to talk about the base for a minute. All right, let's get dialectical here. So, you say that socialism, or you say that the USSR was state capitalist, but the three things that I mentioned earlier that you can get directly from Marx himself in Capital Volume 1. Generalized commodity production. There was no generalized commodity production. There was no wage labor. Um, and there was no profiteering. It was according to a plan.
Well,
So,
that's not true. There wasn't wage labor because there wasn't money, but surplus value was still extracted from all the workers who had no control whatsoever in the production or the nature of their, of their work. It was still like authoritarian leaders who owned, albeit indirectly through party control, factories where people who were not paid or, compensated for the full value of their labor worked tirelessly. Um, they went even a step farther because in the Soviet Union, sometimes they would move people. Like, they would move people to a new district to work. Again, we don't do that over here. You can move to a new city if you want to, but the state can't force you to move over to Albuquerque so you can
well,
keep working as a satellite engineer.
well, Marx actually never said that workers would receive what they fully produced. That was actually a critique he made of Lassalle, Ferdinand Lassalle, and I
I'm not
mean,
saying, just to clarify, I'm not saying fully.
okay,
I'm just saying
yeah.
that they got like nothing from it. Incredibly industrious and productive Soviet workers went back to their shit apartments, their tiny little tenements, with this scantest bit of like luxury goods that they had like available to them.
Well, then again, I would have to, attribute most of that to the absolute raising that happened during World War II. But economically speaking, right, there was no buying and selling of the means of production, and there was no. And you also said something about surplus value, but it's hard to think about surplus value because what Marx theorized value to be, and I don't want to get too technical here, but Marx essentially imagined that you have to have generalized commodity production in order to have that passing from private to social. In other words, you have to have generalized commodity production to have. You can have surplus extraction, but you wouldn't have surplus value because they weren't working to increase their exchange value. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but do you see how this is you like kind of wiggling around like 150-year-old terms to explain away the fact that the Soviet Union preserved the same basic class distinctions as the United States, except worse? That's my main
Well,
issue. Well, like we can talk about like, well, there was no buying and selling of the commodity and like the
yeah,
means of
that's a
production
key
never.
part of capitalism is the
Yeah,
buying and selling
but
of
it
labor
does,
power.
but it's utterly irrelevant to the actual livelihood and well-being of the millions of people who were in the Soviet Union. Like nobody would go like, "Man, this sucks. I hate the fact that this is like being owned by a capital owner. I'm beholden to a party official who controls my workplace and demands of me a certain level of output, and I get nowhere near the total level of productivity that I produce in this factory." And then someone else taps him on the shoulder and he's like, "No, no, 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 you don't understand. There's no generalized commodity production, and the means of production are bought and sold. So this is totally different, even though like it doesn't actually affect their livelihood at all." You know?
Well, their
Like that
livelihood was generally increased. I mean, especially considering, if you want to get a little bit historically materialist here, especially considering Tsarist Russia, where the government would just pull up to your house and point a gun at you and demand your surplus labor.
they
Um,
literally did that in Stalinist Russia, like to more people too. And also, I'm not saying that the
so,
Soviet
are you
Union was
against taxes?
wait, wait,
Okay, okay.
wait, hold on. I just want to say, I'm not saying the Soviet Union is worse than Tsarist Russia. I'm saying I don't think the Soviet Union did any better for its people than a capitalist like nation would have done. If the Soviet Union had a Russian Revolution that was all populist, and then they had it was like the American Revolution, I feel like it would have kind of developed in a similar way. You still would have had the industrial boom. You still would have had the horrible exploitation of the workers that have taken place, in USSR and America. It seems like it would have been basically very similar, which makes me think the approach that hardline Marxists take towards the liberation of the proletariat are misguided because they aren't really solving any problems. They're just introducing like a new, similar but not completely identical set of, material conditions. Does that make any sense?
Yeah. Well, if you want to just translate those 19th century terms into today, stuff like full employment, you wouldn't be fired or given a pink slip because, a company has decided to decrease their workforce and increase automation. That kind of stuff
But you
didn't
could be sent to
happen.
Siberia if you criticized your boss, though.
Well, if you criticize your well, hold on. I'm talking.
Yeah, your
So do you
boss is a
agree? Do you
party
agree?
official.
You're talking about political and societal issues. Would you agree economically that there were no capitalists?
I don't I mean, no, because nobody privately owned any means of production. It was all facilitated through the party, but I would consider that a difference without a distinction, or a distinction without a difference. Like, oh, we're not capitalists, we don't own it. We're just incredibly powerful party officials who own everything within our massive country through the apparatus of like central leadership. Like, basically, you get the same problem. They're not capitalists, but they're state capitalists, because their ownership of the means of production is facilitated through the apparatus of state power. That's why I use that term. It's not like capitalism exactly, but it preserves the same material relations.
Well, I wouldn't actually call it capitalism by definition at all
Yeah, state
because
capitalism.
state capitalism can exist, but state capitalism, going back to, I'm just trying to stick to this definition here, going back to, the buying and selling of labor power and means of production, etc.
I just want to say I don't disagree with those definitions.
Okay.
I completely concede. I haven't read Capital. I haven't read the First Internationale. I recognize that I am, when it comes to a strict understanding of theory, probably lacking in a great many ways. But my first and foremost concern, fundamentally, is the well-being of people. And it's weird to me. Like I feel like by any empirical sociological metric or any political science metric, you could find the Soviet Union was fucking horrible. Like it was a horrible, horrible state. And I think one of the reasons for that is the way in which they try to challenge the systems of production within capitalism didn't meaningfully change the power relations between the average person and the people in charge. So, like, what good is it if it doesn't bring about better outcomes? It
Okay.
seems to me like we're just like looking for a different coat of paint, you know?
So that kind of gets into the whole anarchism discussion because I think you would agree that no matter what, there has to be some kind of distinction of power.
What do you mean?
Well, there has to be some kind of distinction between administrators and regular people. Would you agree?
I mean, I admit I'm not as well read on anarcho-syndicalism as I am the metrics of market socialism, but I believe that at least my subscription here would be that a good way of running society would basically just be to have these giant super unions that are democratically controlled by the people who work within the firms that are associated with those super unions, and that a collective council of those super unions elected officials would be kind of like the highest governmental authority in the world. I While I do not see the need for a state, there of course like there must be some hierarchies, of course, like you need someone like to be in charge of making sure the water lines are going from here to there, or making sure that this street is being cleaned up. Like, yeah, of course, there has to be that. We have to preserve those relations.
Well, it's funny you say that because there were actually a significant amount of co-ops in the USSR that had constitutional rights to their property.
That's interesting. I'm not familiar with that. I'd have to look into it before I could meaningfully
Oh yeah,
address that.
yeah. When recollectivization happened, that was that was also a big deal in China. What Mao was trying to do is make a bunch of little co-ops or communes, and then basically
Mhm.
synthesize them all into one big commune. Yeah, you weren't aware that. Um,
But was there ultimate state control over that commune?
no, well, just going off the Constitution, they weren't constitutionally allowed to seize their property. No, they had to pay
Was this
taxes,
something that
but no.
Well, sure, yeah. Is this something that happened for a very short length of time before inevitably it got consolidated into state power, or was there actually like a long-standing and successful implementation of worker cooperatives that were divorced from the authority of the state, as they would be here in the United States, where the state has no direct control over any economic measure?
Yeah, it was in multiple constitutions, even going
But
back
did it
to
actually
after the Nuki.
happen?
Yeah, yeah, it did.
Okay, I would have to look up that. I'd have to look more into that before I could meaningfully address that, because the impression that I had had is that there were some short-term experiments that were tried, but after they were tried, they were kind of obliterated, because the state is an all-consuming monster that just wants to control all the means of production within it. You know,
Yeah, and that's something that I have a problem. Do you agree with the anarchist definition of the state that the state is a monopoly of violence?
I think that's one of the things it is. Yeah, there's probably. I mean, the definition varies, I guess, in who you ask, but that's definitely one of the key distinctions, right?
Yeah, I do think to some extent there is a monopoly of violence, but the problem I have is a lot of people oppose, a lot of anarchists specifically oppose Marxist definition of the state and go with that one, but it's really, really unscientific. It's really immaterial because a feudal state, actually what happened back in the day is feudal states were fighting with capitalist states, and Marx talks about, well, I don't want to I don't want to seem like an asshole or pretentious or whatever, but Marx did say that like feudal states would fight with capitalist states because both of these states inherently had different distributions of surplus. They were
Yeah, well,
antagonistic.
the way I learned, and I don't know if this is a specifically anarchist or Marxist definition, but when I was in political science classes, I was taught that states as we understand them did not exist until around the 18th century. That the modern political conceptualization of a state with a single central government that has discrete borders around, around its edges, that where all the power can be deferred to a single fundamental legal entity, whether that be a constitution or a king or a god or whatever, and a monopoly on violence, that is a very distinctly modernist invention, and that prior to that, like kingdoms or empires weren't really states in the sense that we understand them to be today, because like feudal societies would greatly decentralize the monopoly over violence. Kings would decentralize it to the aristocracy, and the aristocracy would usually allow private armies to be raised and controlled by very wealthy landowners or merchants, and that if a war was ever to be made, like noblemen would be expected to bring their armies together to the king, who maintained in relation a very small standing army, compared to that of like his collective lieges. So that was what I was taught when it comes to the modern conceptualization of a nation state.
Yeah, well, then again, like it's all about definitions, and definitions can, like words can describe anything. I'm sure you and I agree, but I would say that feudalism had
Mhm.
a state. It's just the the personification like of the state was in the landlords, and then the landlords would answer to the higher power, which was the monarchy. And that would actually fit into the Marxist definition as well as the anarchist. But I take issue with the anarchist definition.
Yeah, I don't care too much about the definition. At the end of the day, and I don't mean this to be disrespectful towards you,
No,
because
that's
theory is
fine.
very important, and I respect people who read theory. I think people who get too hung up on theory, or people who get too hung up on definitions sometimes, are acting counterproductively to the broader interests of socialists. When the socialist revolution happens, if it happens, it will not be led, I hope, by people like yourself and me. It will be led by some fucking former oil rig technician like dumb fucks who just want to like secure a good living for themselves. That ultimately the material history of the world is driven by the interests of the working class and not people who are hyper fixated on like familiarizing myself or themselves with the nuances of prior definitions. I care about some really basic stuff. I care about healthcare. I care about housing. I care about democratization of the workplace and eventually the abolition of borders in the state. But I don't think you need that strong a theoretical grounding to understand why those things are good. Maybe a strong theoretical grounding to understand how to best achieve those things or how to best interpret the relation of that state of society to another. But on a fundamental level, I think these are very desirable goals that we can all work towards. I would like to believe all my leftist comrades, even if I disagree with them on superficial things, are united in their love of freedom, of individual rights, of democracy, and of democratization of both our political systems and our workplace. You know.
Yeah, I agree, and those kind of liberal values are definitely a part of leftism. I wouldn't contradict you on that. I just really believe in the Vanguard Party, and that's why I read so much, and that's why I study so much because, I look back. I don't want to say this like over and over again, but Marx does talk historically about in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte how peasants can't lead themselves in a revolution. Like they can't because they're peasants. Like they're ultimately submissive to the Lord. They don't have any alternative because they don't know the history and they don't know how to use the history
But
dialectically in order to determine what they should do.
do you feel like that framing might basically end up reinforcing the same classist distinction that we have in a capitalist society in whatever post-capitalist society we would fight for? Because that contempt of the common folk is kind of what led to a bunch of vanguard parties turning into elitist, hyper-exclusionary political oligarchies. The idea that only they have the intelligence and will to power to lead the stupid proles like sheep along to their salvation. I mean, the world has changed quite a bit over the past 150 years, and I'd like to think the average person is more educated, but I would contest that description even back then. I mean, God help me, like look at the Black Army back during the Soviet Union. Look at some of the anarchist projects prior to the 20th century. There were plenty of instances of highly mobilized, highly willful socialist leaders that were mobilized not from some elite core group of upper middle class merchants and academics, but rather from the working people fighting collectively to secure power for their own. Um,
Well, in terms of the Black Army, I definitely wouldn't want to cite the Black Army because I'm not sure if you're aware, but the Black Army actually had peasant chain gangs and another example is like the CNTFIA, which I'm not sure if
Yeah,
you're
yeah.
aware, but it was a
I'm not saying the
massive
Black Army was
bureaucracy.
perfect. I'm just saying it's an
Okay.
example of a highly dedicated, militarized, willful socialist group that wanted to seize, power or move the population in a given direction, and it did it without any like super highly educated like labor aristocracy, academic, intellectual types telling them what to do.
Well, ultimately, I am a bit of a technocrat because I don't really believe that the average worker will be able to predict what is the best for them. I mean, all we have to do is look at the lumpen in the United States.
Yeah, no. See, this is the problem I have. You're an authoritarian. You don't believe the average person is intelligent enough to meaningfully like dictate or guide the society that they live in. That's the problem that I keep
Well, are
running
you for
into.
direct democracy?
Yeah, absolutely. Anytime. The reason people are stupid isn't because they're like that fundamentally. They're stupid because we live in a highly a society of ideology where they're taught things that are contrary to their class interests. But we can fix that. It's just like
Well, that
like
seems
you
authoritarian to me.
Well, no, just by making the education system more respective of actual reality. Like that's, I think,
Well, yeah,
not
that's what
really
I mean. I
authoritarian.
don't I don't mean I'm not like saying genetically like an oil worker could never get out of lumpen pearl status, but until like that's why you need a vanguard. Like who is going to actually go out and
You're,
educate
you're
people on
making an
socialism? It's not going to be the capitalists. It's going to be the
You're
vanguard.
making an anti-democratic argument, though. I'm okay with certain elements of a vanguard party, you know? Imagine if the revolution was tomorrow. Maybe we could work with Comrade AOC or Senator Bernie
Beautiful.
Sanders, and they can. No, you say you, but they're doing more right now to advance the material interest of the common person than you and I ever could in 1,000 lifetimes. So I'll withhold my disdain. But yeah, like say, like what if a vanguard party is a democratically elected group of politicians beholden to the interests of a populist left, and then when revolutionary activity takes place, we can sort of work with them to integrate the revolutionary guard into the means of production, into the broader state apparatus. But that doesn't necessarily entail any contempt for the intelligence of the average worker, the way you've kind of demonstrated.
Well, I think right now there
You
is.
asked me if I wanted direct democracy, but like kind of disdainfully. Do you have an issue with direct democracy?
Well, yeah, I do. I'm more into representative democracy.
I feel like most leftists would argue that representative democracy is a bad meme.
A bad meme.
Yeah, right? Because you're preserving power hierarchies and relations
Well, I'm
that
not
could
against
be dissolved.
hierarchy. I'm not an
This is the
anarchist.
problem I keep running into. I want to do left unity, but I feel like you're less interested in the liberation of the working people and more interested in like a state coded red where you and other academics like are the ones who are deciding what the stupid proletariat have to do next.
So, do you think that an average worker is at the same capacity to govern a country as someone who has an education in economics, for example?
Well, I don't think that direct democracy necessarily entails an abandonment of expertise. I think it's very possible to have systems of democracy that incorporate expertise while also, working within the will of the people. I'm not
Well,
anti-expertise at all, but like you're not advocating for
well, at
expertise, you're
some point,
advocating for
those people with
authority.
expertise are going to have wield some kind of power.
Sure, but I'm not saying we don't need any power whatsoever. And I'm also in favor of a transitionary state. Like that's what market socialism is, right?
No.
So it
Well,
would be like this
actually,
gradual process of bringing us towards a more radical long-term solution.
um, I don't know if I like technically yes. Um, Market socialism is a transition, but I wouldn't call it socialism. I wouldn't call it what Marx called it.
Yeah,
By
I mean
those
that's
categories.
fine. We can work with like fundamental like, language differences. That's totally fine with me. I don't want to argue
Yeah, really
semantics or
quick
anything.
though, do you
But yeah.
follow the anarchist definition of the abolition of all unjust hierarchies?
I mean, I think that's the philosophy of anarchism, right? It really depends on how unjust those hierarchies, right? Like you'd have to make an argument for the legitimacy of each hierarchy, if at all possible. But yeah, I would agree. Like we want to get rid of as many as possible.
Yeah, it's just the problem is when you say unjust, that inherently becomes an argument of subjectivity because that's from your
Yeah, of
perspective.
course.
So that is
Yeah,
authoritarian.
that is not what authoritarianism means.
Well, you can define any word to mean what you want, but what I meant by authoritarian
No, you
is
can't. Well, you can't. Normally, you can, but in that specific case, you can't define that word to mean that thing.
well,
That
that's
would
just
be
how I
that
was
would be
using
like
the word.
that would be like saying like I'm anti-racist, and then you would say, okay, exactly how much racism should we get rid of? What is racist? What isn't? How do we decide? And I say, well, I'm not entirely sure. We'd have to look at it case by case. There's a lot of nuance there. And then you would say, heh. That's authoritarian, buddy. No, it's not. We all have different perspectives of what's right and wrong. I think that people who are anarchists will generally agree there are some things that we can all believe to be unjust hierarchies. And even if we disagree on those things, I would rather live in a society where people are having principled disagreements over which hierarchies are ethical and which are unethical than live in a society where people are unironically arguing about opening up during a quarantine so that the red line can go up, or arguing about opening implementing a society which claims to be revolutionary for the workers' interest but fundamentally preserves the same power relations that you experience in a social in a capitalist society. Like I would rather have those arguments with anarchists, you know?
Well, I mean, you are aware that there's never been a society that hasn't had that power relation. Like I would say it had a power relation, but it didn't have a class relation.
I mean, there have been small experiments that have, I think, done well to extol anarchist values. Your society has never succeeded. Every single society that you have
Well, it
ever
depends on how you
advocated for,
define success.
it definitely does. But every society that has ever been brought about by your basic political principles has turned into an authoritarian state every
Well, I could say the
single
same for
time.
anarchism, actually.
If that is the case, it is because the anarchist state failed and was taken over by a more powerful neighbor, not because society
No,
itself was an authoritarian society.
no, the CNT self in place labor camps onto themselves, concentration camps, as well as a bureaucratic government. This was before the CNT actually fell.
I'm not familiar with that specific example, but if they had gulags, then I would absolutely like denounce that.
Yeah, so I mean, CNTFIA, which is something that I see a lot of ANCOMs absolutely fanboy, like, is essentially as like I read a book called Workers Against Work, and the author is a bit questionable, but he basically goes through and he compares the Gulag system to the CNTFIA system of worker concentration camps, and it's
I would need
mirroring.
to look I would need to look more into this because like based off this convo so far, I have a feeling that if I read more into this, I would have a rebuttal that I could use here. But
Yeah,
like
yeah.
we don't have to look at relatively narrow examples. The Soviet Union was a totalitarian state that turned into an oligarchy after like the wall fell. Mao's China was an authoritarian state that is now a hyper authoritarian capitalist dystopia. Like every like major project that like MLs have like gotten their hands on, with the possible exception of Cuba. I am very permissive of Cuba for a wide variety of reasons. Like very consistent like problems that arise concerning authoritarianism. Yeah, so I'm extremely skeptical. I would like why don't what we do first? Like this is the thing that we why don't we focus on this first? First, we ensure a workers' democracy. So that the proletariat in this country have a meaningful control over the systems of power within it, and then we can see whether or not we can start to take harder steps towards decentralization or towards like decommodification and stuff. You know?
Yeah, I would agree with that, but ultimately you're going to have some, some kind of apparatus that moves towards. And then again, that brings into the whole question of anarchism. Like, let's say for example you had a revolution, and then you're trying to discern which hierarchies are just and unjust. Well, I think we can all understand that nobody's going to be unanimous about what hierarchies are just and unjust. And then what would you do with the people that don't disagree, that disagree with your interpretation of what is a just or unjust hierarchy?
Well, that's democracy, right? I mean, if they lose and the majority disagree with them, then they just better fucking live with it. If they want to like pitch a revolution because they don't like policies that have been implemented, then I mean, I don't like what if they start like shooting up a square, I guess they can get shot too. I don't know. That's democracy. You don't always get what you want.
Well, yeah, I agree, but there has to be some point to where we, say, well, something like child labor. I mean, if the majority, this is why I have a problem with direct democracy, is because if the majority of people vote on something that is inherently destructive, but because they vote on it and because they want it, they're going to represent themselves in a form of mob rule.
But there are ways to implement direct democracy without it just being mob rule. I mean, you can still have a constitution with superseding rules that dictate like terms of governance and what have you. I don't you realize you're giving me anti-democracy arguments, right? Not just like
Anti
anti-direct democracy.
direct democracy.
Yeah, but like the proletariat, we need a vanguard party. The peasants aren't smart enough. The proletariat can't lead themselves. If you just let them decide what they're going to do, it's going to be mob rule. Like you realize these are like I could hear these takes from a monarchist, right?
Well, the
Like
peasants were actually, well, I'm talking about historically, like back then, the peasants were actually antagonistic to the proletariat.
the the peasants were the proletariat.
No, peasant is a different class. They're not proletariat.
Okay, there is no such meaningful distinction between peasant and proletariat that I think they have a fundamentally different class relation. They are both people who fundamentally must sell their labor, who do not own capital in order to survive. Like,
No. I mean, sell their labor in order to survive. Well, peasants actually, well, I would argue that there is a distinction in class because there was no market for the subsistence of the labor class, aka wage labor. And all these other economic categorical differences, like peasants were absolutely not proletariats. Like, there was no
wait,
wage
but wait, wait,
labor.
wait. So wait. There's bourgeois, and this is what I know. Bourgeois, proletariat. Bourgeois own the means of production. The proletariat must sell their labor to those who own the means of production. The peasantry did this, yes? There's probably a distinction, broadly speaking, and I'm willing to recognize that distinction.
Well,
But
it's
when I
not
say like
broad.
when I say like you think the peasantry are too stupid to do their own like democracy work, and you're like, well, they actually hated the proletariat. Like I don't know what the relation is here. I'm sure that farm workers were antagonistic broadly towards the industrialization in the working world. I don't know what that has to do with like their ability to be democratic
Well,
though.
would you agree that petite bourgeois people are more oftentimes than not opposed to proletarian people?
Petite. I mean, yeah, like small business owners, like
Yeah.
generally, yeah, they tend to operate in their own material interests, which are usually similar to that of the broader bourgeois, but not always.
Yeah, well, it's the same. It's the same thing, really. Like the peasants were in opposition to the proletariat.
But why were the peasants like the petite bourgeois?
Some peasants could actually be considered petite bourgeois, like kulaks. They like you Google kulak, it says they're a peasant, but they're not a peasant. Like classical, like categorically, they're not a peasant. They're petite bourgeois
Why are they not a peasant?
because they own means of production and hire wage labor, and they extract surplus value, which would make them petite
Uh,
bourgeois.
but then their surplus value was extracted by the Soviet state, right? Like kulaks had to like they didn't
Well,
just
that's
like
just
own their own
taxes.
stuff. Yeah, but there's a pretty big difference between just taxes and the state is going to take basically everything you can give them. Also, you have to meet production quotas or you're in trouble.
Well, the
Like there's
state
a
didn't take everything they had. Like private, I don't want to say privately owned, but cooperatives that had a constitutional right to their own capital, they kept surplus. So basically, how the system works is you work, you pay your workers, you pay your machinery, and then you have what's left over. Now, parts of this is going to go to yourselves and to the state, and that's how it operated in the USSR. And that's exactly what Marx was talking about. That's exactly what how a socialist society would work.
yeah, I mean, I'm not opposed to taxes at all, but the kulaks were subservient to the state as like any other entity. Like that's why what happened to them because like
Well,
it
they
wasn't like
weren't
they thought.
subservient to the state. They actually defied the state by
Well,
committing
yeah,
acts
but
of
defiance
terrorism.
can only take wait. Defiance can only take place in the context of subservience. Otherwise, there's nothing to be defiant to.
Well, that's
Like
just kind of a word mince, but
yeah, but like they didn't thumb their noses at Stalin, and Stalin like shrugged, like ah fuck, guess we can't rely on that anymore. Like uh, millions died, and people were prevented from leaving the famine-touched areas. Like
well, yeah,
and
Kulaks actually opposed Stalin. So I
yeah,
mean
I
under
everybody should oppose Stalin. Stalin was horrible. He
no,
was probably
I would disagree that
really.
everyone opposed Stalin. Yeah, I would.
No, no, everyone should have opposed Stalin.
Oh,
No, no, not
okay, yeah.
everyone should have. Yeah,
Well,
he was a
that's your
horrible.
prerogative, but in the
No, no.
context of the
Do you
USSR,
disagree?
do I disagree that?
Even
Okay, yeah, yeah,
Lenin
yeah.
didn't want Stalin in. Like even Lenin said, "This guy's fucking dangerous. He's a fucking lunatic. Don't let this guy get in charge." He had to kill his opponent in order to get that position. He chased him out of the
Well,
USSR and he killed him.
Stalin actually democratically won over Trotsky's program. I mean, if you want the citation, I can give it to you.
Adolf Hitler won and then was
No, he
legally
was
appointed
appointed.
chancellor.
He didn't win a
Yeah,
democratic
yeah.
election. He was
He
appointed.
no, he won. He got okay. He got like 30% of the vote prior, and then he was appointed. These were legal processes.
Yeah,
The
but he made
legality
himself a dictator illegally by changing the constitution.
and is it? I'm sorry. Is it legal to murder your opponent, Trotsky?
Well, the murdering happened a lot longer, but even
Yeah,
before
because
that,
he chased Trotsky. No, he chased Trotsky out. There was a Oh my God. I'm
Well,
sorry.
hold
I
on.
haven't read up on my wait, I'm sorry. I haven't read up on my Stalin shit for a while. The idea that Stalin succeeding Lenin was an act of democracy is
Do
ludicrous.
you want the
Stalin,
citation?
you can send me a citation if you want. I'm sorry, was this party democracy or was this real democracy?
Well, the word real kind of begs a question because the way the
Yeah, it does.
Soviet
Yeah, yeah, because
system.
I don't think a society that only lets 10% of its party elites vote is actually a democratic society.
Well, who do you think got those people in power in the first place? Was it the state? Was
What
it the autonomous
you're
being of the state or the
describing,
workers?
you're defending an oligarchy. You're saying because Stalin was a strong man who was able to get party officials in power, that their voting for him was legitimate. You're literally defending an oligarchy right now. You realize that, right?
Well, I mean, I'd like you to answer. Well, okay, I'm defending an oligarchy. Well, I wouldn't actually call it an
No, 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 no.
oligarchy.
I'm sorry. You cannot. You're right. It's worse than an oligarchy. It's
No,
worse
it's actually not
Because Stalin
categorically.
killed other oligarchs. He would disappear people in the middle of the night if he didn't like where they were going.
See,
Stalin was a paranoid man. He would literally like wake up in a fever and then have people disappear because he had dreams that they were going to backstab him.
well, I think the entire Central Committee had good reason to be paranoid, but I mean, I can send you stuff about that, but really,
So you're defending totalitarianism.
well, these
How
are
can
all
you
just Vosh. These are all
why
just
would you
empty
why would
words.
you
These are
lie me?
100%
No,
empty words.
democracy is an empty word. I'm sorry.
You
The
just said
last
the
time I
word
heard that was from an alt-writer.
totalitarianism. You just said the
The
word
last time I heard
totalitarianism.
that was from an alt-writer. Yeah, the last time I heard that was from an alt-writer.
Okay, I'm an alt-righter. Congratulations. Look,
Why are
Vosh.
you
Look.
wait, why?
Hold on. Look, Vosh. The thing that you do on your streams is you go about and you say words like totalitarianism and authoritarian, but you never define them.
These
Like,
are
let's
words with
define them.
no, wait, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Do you think that if I Google the definition of the term totalitarian, it's not going to describe Stalinist Russia?
Well, give me a definition.
Let's just Google it because oh sure.
Okay. I mean,
Totalit
I'm sure you're
You
aware
you
that
realize what you're
words.
doing right now. I have literally had this conversation word for word with Nazis. Like, you think Hitler was a totalitarian? There were dissenting parties within his mix. You can't possibly say Hitler was actually well loved by his people. I have heard all of these arguments before from neo-Nazis. The fact that you would stoop
Well, that's a
this
bit of
low
a horseshoe theory,
to
isn't it?
defend a failed that would only be the case if you were actually a leftist, my friend. The fact that I have heard all these arguments from Nazis and their effort to defend their failed state as you try to defend yours is fucking insane to me. Why would you ever do this? Like, do you really think you're representing the will of the people, the interests of the proletariat? Well, you're defending fucking Stalin? It's always it's okay. A system of government that is centralized, so that's a bing right there, and dictatorial, that's a bing right there, and requires complete subservience to the state. That's a bing right there. If you were a dissident to the state, you were fucking disappeared.
Well, how
There.
do you okay, let's define dictatorial. So dictatorial is usually one
Are you
figurehead,
going
is
to
it not?
semantics your way out of
I'm not.
acknowledging the most
Do you think I would argue that the CNTFIA was a dictatorship? They had bureaucrats. They had a labor bureaucrat.
what are you referring to?
The CNTFIA.
I have autism. You're going to have to give me the full name of the thing and not just the acronym.
Well,
I
I
can't tell
actually
you.
have ASD as well, in case you're being
So now
unironic. So,
I am being unironic, and I'm unironically asking you to give me the full name for the thing you're
okay,
describing.
so from one aspect to another, it's the oh fuck, it's anarchist Catalonia.
Yeah, okay. I'm not here to defend anarchist Catalonia.
So what do you
I don't
have any
defend previous
previous
states.
society that has ever existed in the history of the
Irrelevant to
world?
what we're talking about right now. Why the fuck are you defending
Because it's an
Stalin?
idea that only exists in your head, and I argue with ideas
No,
that only exist in your head.
market socialism
No,
is what
your
I advocate for on
ideology.
stream.
Your
What ideology?
ideology. It only exists in
What?
your head, therefore it's ad hoc.
Market socialism?
No, anarchism plus market socialism.
I don't wait. I don't advocate for anarcho-syndicalism on stream because I don't think it's pragmatic for us to advocate for societies we're centuries away from achieving. I advocate for the next step with the ultimate goal eventually of seeing where we move from there. But if we move to a market socialist society and then it's found out that maybe the fundamental economic presuppositions of anarchism aren't that tenable, I don't care. I'm not married to those positions. I'm willing to jump ship and find something that works better. My main concern is the next workable thing. How exactly are we making the world better for
Well, I
proletarians?
can I can tell you what I would like to do pragmatically. Like as if I was, governing the United States.
Would you run? Would you like get a bunch of people in power and then run like contested against like another person and then have them murdered and then assume total power? Like, what's your guide? I guess.
Well, that's a bit of a loaded statement because Trotsky wasn't murdered until well after that referendum.
He was chased out of the Soviet Union
Yes,
as
but
Stalin
okay, all right,
snuck
all right.
out.
Let's just get away from
Out
the
wait. Why? That's so dishonest. Why would
what?
you say that? He was
Because
chased out about threat of death. Just because the death happened after doesn't mean that the threat of death didn't exist prior.
yes, Trotsky was a good boy. He didn't do nothing.
I'm sorry. Did you just didn't do nothing me? Did you just pivot off of acknowledging a point by trying to suggest that the person who was murdered was legitimate? What the fuck are you talking about?
Well, yeah. Do you think Stalin should have
You're the
been
reason
murdered?
why I can't. Stalin never should have been put in power. He was a lunatic and Lenin knew it. He was just strong and charismatic. That's the only reason he was kept around.
So do you agree that treason should lead to death?
What do you mean treason? He ran against Trotsky. What treason did Trotsky commit by
Well, this was
running against
after.
Stalin?
Your point was is that
After
Stalin
he
was
was chased out by threat of death.
your point was, Vaush, is that Stalin was you basically
Treason? I
equate
can't
hold
believe you
on, you
listen
keep
to a
interrupting me,
leftist
dude.
right now.
You keep interrupting me. You just compared Hitler to Stalin. Hitler appointed himself and then changed the German constitution to make himself a
No, I
dictator.
compared your defense of Stalin to other alt-righters' defense of Hitler.
Okay, well, do that all day. I don't care. I'm not a. I mean,
I know you
frankly, the
don't.
all
You
right
don't give a
can't read,
fuck about
so.
any. You don't give a fuck about the proletariat, dude. You like reading in theory, imagining yourself smarter to the average person, and jerking off to the fantasy that you may one day lead the Vanguard Party. Don't you fucking scoff at me. I know exactly what your type is like. You're the fucking petite authoritarian. You're the one who believes that if you were born in a different class station, you could have been the one to lead the idiots behind you, to lead the banner into battle. Okay, but in reality, you and me are no different from the average person. We're a little bit more well read, but we are just as stupid and self interested as every person watching this and every person right now on an oil rig or working at a fucking barista job at Starbucks. We are not above them. We are them. And I would not want to be part of any leftist revolution that precludes their will for our fucking enlightened
Who do you think
sensibilities.
gives the Vanguard Party in the power in the first place? Do you think the Vanguard do you think the Vanguard manifests themselves by virtue of being the Vanguard with like weapons out of thin air?
What do
Like
you
they're
mean?
given the Vanguard
Hitler
are
rode the back of
given
popular
power.
support too. I don't know. This is a non
Well,
sequitur. Hitler
this is
also rode the
literally
back of
just
popular support.
what's that law of the internet that all conversations will lead to Hitler? I mean, like what's the
I
comparison here?
actually can't believe how willing you are to divert back to bad faith. Why was the first 50 minutes of this discussion so like such an attempt at good faith when you were hiding all of this from me?
Well,
Like
because
why?
when I'm talking about an ideology, I like to give an example. It's not perfect. Nothing is ever perfect. I don't even like it. I wouldn't even want to live there because, frankly, I would probably get thrown in jail. But I think that it's something that we should. Do you agree that it's something we should look at and say they did this, they did that wrong. Let's go on from here. Do you agree?
I well yeah, of course, but they did so many things wrong. I
Okay.
don't think there's any meaningful benefit in addressing this. And this has nothing to do
Yeah,
with your
that's why I
faith.
didn't want to, but you said I was being dishonest by trying to pivot away from it.
I would not feel comfortable being a part of any revolution alongside people who unironically defend Stalin. Anybody who believes defending Stalin has anything to do with the
Well,
interests of
that's kind of
socialism
infantile.
is antithetical. I know, yeah, you got your little insult from Lenin. I know. I bet you felt really cool saying that.
The
No,
word.
there's nothing infantile. I know why. The only people who use infantile as an insult are tankies because they've read fucking Lenin. Okay, you
You think
cannot
Lenin
step
was a
past.
tanky?
I said you're the
Do you
tankies.
think
Tankies
leftcoms are
like to read Lenin.
tankies?
What the
Leftcoms
fuck does
like
that have to do?
Bordiga. Leftcoms like because you just said you read Lenin, you're a tanky.
Why are
Leftcoms
you
like
pivoting?
Bordiga,
Why are you
and
pivoting right now?
Bordiga
This has nothing to do with
likes
what I was
Lenin.
saying.
So
Wait, I'm sorry. Are you denying that there was a relationship between your decision to use the term infantile and Lenin's writings on the left
no,
communism
of
and
course
infantile
not.
disorder? Okay, then why the fuck are you going off on that? It has no
Because
relevance whatsoever to the discussion.
you just said, you know how I know you're tanky because you use the word infantile and that comes from Lenin. So what that correlation implies is that by being a tanky, you read Lenin.
No. The correlation being that people who think they're smart because they read theory have a tendency to ape Lenin's language without understanding his arguments. Now, listen, I cannot believe that there is any way future for socialism should it be led by people who believe it is defensible to argue in favor of Stalin's legitimacy
Well,
as the
Stalin is
leader.
dead now. I mean, I think we could all get
This is
over
irrelevant.
Stalin.
Why do you keep pivoting? You
Because
read a
you
lot.
just
You're
said,
probably more well read on this stuff than I am, but I hope and I'm really not trying to come off conceited here, but I hope this conversation shows you, or is a reminder to you, that there is a fuckload more to socialism, praxis, and actual advocacy than silently reading books and imagining yourself better than the people who Marx was describing as the peasantry, or who Lenin was describing as the lumpen proletariat. Okay,
So
that would be
how do you think
my
Marx came to
request.
his ideology? Did he just what do you think Marx did? Did he read books or did he just what?
What do you mean?
Well, you just said, well, all you do is read or sit around in silence and read books. What do you think Marx did?
I don't know what you I don't know what you
Marx
do.
spent years in the British Museum writing Capital. Should he have not have
Like, you
done
think
that?
I'm opposed to writing? What do
Well,
you
you're
mean?
criticizing me for you think I'm like a left chair ANCOM, right? Or
No, I
like a
think
left
you're a fucking
an armchair.
Stalinist. I think you're an authoritarian. I think you wish you were born into a position where you could be the one to lead. That you would have to be the one to make the pragmatic decisions about which businesses you would crush, which fields you would burn, which people you would send to Siberia. I think you imagine that if you had been in Stalin's position, you would have done a better job. I know what people like you think like because I used to think like you, and I've
Well,
argued
I
with
wouldn't
plenty of
want to be in
Marxists
his
who think
position
like you.
first of all because I wouldn't have the actual qualifications to. But do you
You
want to
said
do you
you
want to
had to
keep talk?
choke that one out, didn't
Do you
you?
want to
No, no,
keep
no.
screaming about Stalin, or do you want to get back to what we were discussing?
Well, we're already 15 minutes over the actual time that I was meant
Oh,
to
oh,
answer.
oh, oh, duh, yeah, okay. So anyway,
All
I
right.
want to give a shout out to my YouTube channel, Leftism Today. It's a nice little YouTube channel. I upload stuff. It's part of the Learn Marx OC branch. And do you have any questions for me, Vosh?
I just Do you understand how an average person who is watching this could come away thinking you're a fucking lunatic and that we should never have anything to do with socialism? This is why when I talk about socialism, I try to frame it through terms. This is why Bernie Sanders talks about socialism. He tries to frame it through terms that are relative to the interests of the proletariat, kind of like what Lenin said, that it is important lest you become a windbag as infantile as the left communists to meet the proletariat at their level of radicalization. It is important to phrase pragmatic efforts in ways that relate to the interests of the average person. But do you understand how, like, what you've said, like, you would come off as like a lunatic to the average person?
If they haven't really done a lot of investigation, sure. I mean, I don't like Stalin. I
What do you
wouldn't
mean
want to live in the
what does that mean?
USSR. I don't like him. I don't like him personally. I don't worship him. I'm not a tanky, but I just think that there were things that Stalin did, like industrialize the USSR the quickest in the entire world, make the USSR have the second largest GDP per capita. Like, this is
You have a
why I
video
learned
on
about this
me.
stuff.
You have a video on me called Vaush is wrong about
Yeah,
immigration
I
and
do that.
illegal.
I do that. I do that. I cited
Hey,
Vorhas. I don't really know.
hey, that's cool. I do that too. Hey, well,
It's clickbait.
maybe I'll take a look at your videos sometime. We can see where our disagreements on immigration are, because I have some very
Yeah,
policy and fact based.
go ahead. Like, in terms of the immigration argument, I literally just cited Vorhas, and I'll be like 100% honest. I haven't even looked into it that much, so if you want to prove me wrong, then 100% absolutely go ahead, but yeah.
Okay, I respect that open invitation for critique. All right, I love
Anyway,
you, buddy. Thank you very
thank
much.
you. I
I appreciate
appreciate
you
it.
coming
My
on.
ears loved
Have
it.
yourself a have yourself a good one. Okay.
You too, man.